Hi, my name is Alyssa Cuffy Anoaha, and you are listening to the Durham Artist Archive. This is where we tell the story of Durham through the eyes of artists. Let's get into it. Hi, welcome back to the Durham Artist Archive. You are here with Alyssa Cuffy Anoaha and my new guest, who is a really talented painter, just all-around artist, and has a really fascinating story. So I'm going to bring it to you first to just tell more about your story and about your creative practices and how you got into them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for making that possible. It's really nice. Yeah, my creative practices were tuned and cultivated pretty much from primary school. So from like 6 to 8, I was in a public school, but then I got into a school called the Steiner School, which was new, where I grew up, and had a lot of access to painting, to dancing, to drama, to pottery, to blacksmithing. And all of these different subjects would come back throughout the years in high school. And that has certainly influenced my approach to art to begin with. But for a very long time in this school, we had to write our own textbooks. And in order to write these textbooks, you weren't allowed to use what we called an eraser. We still had fountain pens and erasers. But we weren't allowed to use the erasers, which means that it had to be flawless in the book. So my mom was pretty after me to write very beautifully, and which was painful. I have very painful memories about that process of like having like late at night to write things in there. But eventually I just developed this deep love for lettering, for playing with letters, sizes, shapes, and with words. So writing became something that I got out of the school that I was in. I also had an arts teacher that was pretty exceptional.
That's so cool. I've been seeing people talk about creating their own curriculum as a way to self-educate. And to me, that means investing in their own research of whatever topic they're interested in. And it sounds like your teachers were encouraging you to do that same thing, but then like document whatever you were learning in those textbooks. Does that sound right?
Yes, and it was really an absence of textbooks in general. So these classes wouldn't actually have any textbooks. We would have a main lesson, like a block of like 4 weeks, where each main lesson would be 90 minutes long, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And we would learn the whole content of biology for 8th grade in these 4 weeks lessons. It was like what we now call an immersion. Like every day it would happen over and over again, and very long lessons. Like it was like a double. I think a double is what you call it. But that made it possible for us to just dive into that deeper, and that gave room for us to kind of draw. We also had to draw things, and our teachers made the most elaborate blackboard paintings of like Greek mythology or chemistry or whatever it was. It was very picturesque, and also, yeah, we weren't allowed to take notes up until a certain age. So we had to really pay attention. And it was less about the product of the book in the end, because they would obviously vary very much with like 4th graders, 5th graders and stuff like this. But it was more about getting into the process of listening well and recording it by yourself and what you have learned from that, as opposed to trying to get like 50 facts about the octopus into a child's mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, but it is the complete opposite of how I experienced school, because we had textbooks, but I also remember furiously trying to take notes while my teacher was talking. But in my attempts to take notes, I was distracted from really hearing what my teacher was saying, because I was just trying to write down the actual words. I don't think I was always able to connect the concepts as well. And it depended on the subject as well. But I think that's a really interesting way to learn. And so I'm curious, how did that tie to your art? You said that you learned a lot about lettering and like writing. How did that lead you to like your creativity and like what your art would end up looking like.
Yeah. So I think one thing that a lot of kids with ADHD do is doodle in class.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so you probably remember these, like,
Mm-hmm.
the math books with the squares in them and doing the first letters of like just squares and putting a thing here and a thing there, and
Mm-hmm.
it would be an S, and it like seems to be universal in the Western world anyway. And from this writing, I think it just became something where it needed to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the paper, while I have a lot of friends that exclusively paint on paper, letter on paper, to me, I wanted that to grow out and become more plastic too.
Mm-hmm.
I, as my mom would say, found the wrong people that would offer me a path to painting walls at night, painting walls in places where we weren't supposed to be. And often these were places, they were like abandoned places, like neglected
Mm.
spaces. They were spaces that weren't really like 10 years later, people would go and look for these places and call that urban exploring. This is where we
Yeah.
kind of would start to just buy a bit of spray paint
Mm.
in the local arts and comics store. There was like Magic, the card game Magic was like big at the time. So in that store of Magic cards and 100 kids playing Magic, there was this little shelf with spray paint, and you go there and then find the abandoned places
Mm.
and paint there and start experiencing how to paint on something without touching it.
Hmm.
In a way, there is nothing really comparable
Mm-hmm.
outside of the digital world where your medium is not touching the surface with your arm attached to it.
I
So
never
you
thought
have,
of it like
like,
that.
you don't have actually resistance that you can go by. You can tricks a little bit with the can, but like generally your finger becomes like a ghost finger almost. It's like you want to touch it, but you can't really. And I think that was an obstacle that I also really enjoyed.
Mm-hmm.
Beside the scenery and throughout my life, being in neglected spaces that are abandoned, spaces that are forgotten, and recording them and looking into them and feeling out, what's their soul like right now. Because also in biology, we were told in ninth grade that we're learning about the ecosystem of abandoned factory building. And you can see that here in the south with all the mill building and the pump stations, that there is a certain aesthetic to nature reclaiming and taking back. I think New Orleans is probably the place that is
Yeah.
most prominent about this, where plants are like constantly just taking back the sidewalk. And at a certain time of the year, you need to go on the road. You can't actually walk on the sidewalk. The roots are pushing it all up, and the plants are coming from all directions. So this kind of atmosphere of change and transcendence and also repair is something that I think in different parts of my life I always felt drawn to, and they became also safe places. Yeah.
That's such a beautiful take on it. I'm thinking about, so you said you kind of got into that, into like painting on the walls and exploring these spaces when you were young. And how young would you say you were?
Well, I was very introverted and very into sports right up till I spent like 6 months abroad at
Oh,
age 50.
wow.
And that was the first time that I lived abroad for a longer period of time. In a very small country, very far east from where I grew up. So I lived in this little country, and through that experience, my personality changed. Like I grew up in a way that I wasn't grown up before, and also when I returned, my family was kind of starting to fall apart. It became clear that my parents weren't gonna work out for much longer, and my two older siblings had moved out of the house. So there was like kind of this space for me to rebel, the space for me to ask difficult questions. Also, a time where my parents didn't show up really in the way they needed to, and caused harm through that, which is fine, and they did their best. But it is that time where kind of the more rebellious part, and also the part that would take me out at night as a teenager, and skip school and start really spending more time painting than actually going to school when that happened. And that was an important rite of passage for me at the time. Also, running into trouble with other people and bending laws to an extent that, my parents were worried about what I was doing. But I kept it as something that keeps me alive and helps me to express myself when words are hard, and speaking a second language and trying to be vulnerable is also like different than my own language. And at one point, both languages kind of start to disappear. And I have the feeling I don't speak either of them appropriately anymore. But yeah, that's when it all started as a teenager around that time.
Yeah, and I was curious because I think that art form is so tied to youth culture. And so I was curious about what draws young people to that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of books written on that, and I'm not sure if I'm like the authority to say of like how it is. Depending on where we grow up, I think it is clear that this culture was popularized in the 80s, mainly starting in the 70s, but we have talked about it before, putting your name or paintings or scenes on walls is as old as humanity.
Yes.
So it's a very ancient practice that we're just continuing. Obviously, there's a thrill. I still pretty much started when the internet was very young. And it was able then to kind of post things, but it was like, not everybody had a digital camera. And the first digital cameras came into my life when I was like 18 or 19 maybe, that I had access to. So nowadays, like, it's very accessible with the lack of parental control. That's pretty similar to it was in the 90s. You have a lot of access to see people do graffiti in all kinds of ways, be it like large murals, which is ultimately a separate branch of like spray paint art, and also deeply connected. Both of these branches really need each other on the same tree. And I think when kids see that and see graffiti in the streets or see somebody painting, they feel a thrill. There is an air of illegality to that. It doesn't matter where I paint. I can always tell by the way that people like look at me that they're not entirely sure if I'm supposed to be there or not.
Yeah.
Durham has a lot of like tunnels around Ellerby Creek, for example, that are totally ready to be painted, and anybody can paint there. But if you paint there in this dark tunnel and people come by, especially like towards the evening, you can see they're like kind of waiting if they really should pass you or not, which I appreciate. People are just like, I'm not going to do anything, but like you can just walk by and you don't have to ask any questions either necessarily. So there is a protection that this air brings, and also it has very strong consequences in people's lives. People get hurt, people die, people get prosecuted, and especially with activist graffiti, the repercussions can be even greater.
Yeah.
And I think in the times that we live in now, even if you are a young teenager and you have a spray can and write a sentence that would have been okay to write a year ago and now is illegal, disappear for 10 years, something easily. And that, I think, is something that people need to be aware of, that there is this adrenaline kick of going out and breaking the law. But that doesn't necessarily sustain a person for very long.
Yeah.
Even when I grew up, there was already long stories of people that were like past their prime or like had left a lot, 10 years of that behind them, and were like, we did all of this, but these are the things that we have now. These are the things that we don't have because we made these decisions back then.
Yeah,
so more experienced writers would just like also reflect on. And it's a very interesting thing to follow right now, what became of them now. Because there was a second coming of like what we call old school writers. So people that would be 10 years your senior or 15 years your senior, and anybody who was painted in the 80s is pretty much an old school writer. And they would already reflect on mental illness in the scene, toxic masculinity in the scene, racism in the scene. All of these things would be addressed already when I grew up as like a member of the third or fourth generation of graffiti writers. And now there's a bigger culture of teaching. That wasn't the case growing up. And actually the podcast that you and I talked about from my hometown, they bring that to light in that podcast. This toxicity of like older boys. You really gotta say it like this, because when we were active, that meant that we were children, practically. Some of us would be 14, 15, others 18, 19, but technically we were all still children, but we would bully each other very, very badly. With graffiti comes hip-hop, and hip-hop also has transphobia, homophobia. All of this was also very ingrained in the culture. And luckily, graffiti is illegal enough that it also flirts with radical culture. So that people who are radical would use graffiti. Like we can see on, like, you know, both sides of the party spectrum in the US. You have right-wing graffiti, you have left-wing graffiti. Like, all of this exists. I remember.
I never thought of it like that. But that's true.
Everybody uses it.
Yeah, and I can think of examples that I've seen locally on both sides of left and right-wing graffiti.
Yeah, it's civil disobedience. Like, if I want to look at where we are globally right now, if I want to look neutrally at this, then I have to say that, as sad as it may sound, but we kind of had the Democrats or a democratic like system rule for the past, whatever, 20 or 30 years. And this is what we got.
Yeah.
And now I think we may look at 10 to 20 years of the other direction. So what used to be far right and kind of radical resistance, again, neutrally speaking, will now become mainstream. And the opposite side, which is more used to that anyway, will also be like in the opposition again. Graffiti plays a role, muralism plays a role. Since last fall, several like George Floyd murals have been removed, and we will see other people appearing on murals now that are very big. And also this is as old as socialism or communism, where like giant murals of Lenin or Stalin would be depicted. And like, you know, we talked about Banksy and him talking about how companies do that and use like huge wall space to advertise for their products. And I think Fahrenheit 451 is this dystopian book about people that burn books. Like, instead of firefighters, they have these. And in this book, they describe the parlor walls. Like, they're giant screens by the side of the road that basically advertise to you and tell you what to do, what not to do. And the government uses them to deliver messages.
Yeah, well, we've got that.
We've got it now, yes.
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, publicly expressing your opinion with visual art is something that happens way more than people are aware of. Graffiti is just one of the ways that really rubs a lot of people, either in a good way or in a bad way. And it immediately stokes up a bunch of stereotypes, which may or may not be helpful. But it is a culture that hasn't ceased to disappear.
Yeah.
While with a lot of other cultures, youth cultures, one can see they have kind of had their time and then got replaced. There is something to spray painting that can't be commercialized. And I think that's why it survives.
Yeah, you mentioned this before, but there's something really special and unique. There's something that humans are drawn to about just leaving our mark, you know? You mentioned the example of carving our initials into a tree.
Yeah.
That's too much work. I prefer a Sharpie on a bathroom stall. You know, like any sort of that. Like, that's all sort of graffiti, you know? Yeah, what's your take on that?
I just met a bunch of people who are like in their first 5 years, and I'm so scared for them. They don't eat. They, yeah, just live a life that seems so dangerous to me, even though when I was like at that stage, it was the same for me. And
Mm-hmm.
I hold my hand now over people that I know need at least one meal a day. And, like, I'm happy to really accommodate now somebody and be like, rest here while
Yeah.
you're on this 2 week trip of jumping from town to town, like saving all your money for like, getting around in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've been there. I've been on trips where I was like, okay, I don't know where I'm going to get food half of the trip down, but we'll figure it out. And the adventure, I think the camaraderie and within it is also something that is, in certain parts in the United States, very much connected to gang violence, which um, is one strain of the spray painting, in particular of the graffiti culture. They used to mark their territory, just like us graffiti sprayers. Like I used to call them dogs too, because that's just what they do. They just pee on every corner when they go down the street. And then there is this movement in Europe of extreme fans of soccer teams picking up spray paint, and they have actually become really good in their lettering, like in the quality, but they also have like this organization behind them that funnels them. So like a traditional graffiti crew, maybe, like 2 or 3 high school friends who may or may not have some money and may or may not have access to like some spray paint, but it's pretty scraggly. But now imagine you have a group of like athletic sports friends who are ready to put the name of their sports team wherever they go, and they will not necessarily care if they are supposed to do it there or not, but they have like this financial backing of like adults that actually gives them material and possibly like opportunity. And so it has become very outrageous. And one of the most beautiful things about graffiti to me is its connection to the Zulu nation and the non-violent way of using the non-violent part of solving conflict. So graffiti, breakdance, rap were also designed to fight with each other in an artistic way. And have people standing by who will judge you, and you consent to that. You may or may not agree with them. But I hear a lot of violent rhetoric right now in the hip hop culture too, and obviously depending on where you are in the world, because it is very international right now. There's more guns or less guns involved in this, but the idea of graffiti was also like take ownership of your environment and what it looks like, and get better, get up, and like play this game with the others. Like if they're better than you, then you challenge them, and you meet at a spot and you both paint, and then it's going to be clear as day who's
you're playing Pictionary on the wall.
Yes. And I think that's something very beautiful, and something that, with all of the things that we call war and genocide right now, it's really important to remember that we can actually solve conflicts differently. And I don't want to say that the leaders of these countries would do that, but the first one to ask the question, well, how would it be if just the leaders of these respective areas actually fight with each other?
Or spray paint it out. Like,
dance it out.
Be interesting.
Make out. I don't really care.
I
like
would pay
just
to
like
see that.
don't pull everybody else. Don't pull everybody else into it. And I think coming back to like writing and writing as a culture, there is plenty of examples in our society on how to do that.
Yeah. And what you're also making me think of with artists using graffiti art and public art as a form of conflict resolution. When you're putting art on walls, you're like placemaking, right? So, or even that word is kind of like big, but you're impacting how the community impacts or interacts with this space, right? And that can be in good or bad. Going back to humans intrinsically wanting to leave their mark on a space. For me, when I go home and I see a specific mural, I'm like, yes, that is Milwaukee, and that feels so homey and cozy to me. Or if I see a specific piece of graffiti art that's been there for 15 years, I'm like, yeah, that's ours, that's very familiar for me. And I've heard you talk about blank walls being opportunities,
Mm.
right? So whether it's an opportunity for conflict resolution or just self expression or art, I'm really curious to hear more of your thoughts around that. Like, what else do you see when you look at a blank wall?
I think another aspect that, especially here in the city at the Free Expression Wall underneath Main
Mm,
Street,
mm-hmm.
is the part of the communication.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that in the culture they call that a beef, but like people will alter each other's paintings or deface them or comment on them in a way that it's visible to
Mm-hmm.
everybody. And especially when you paint, let's say, like full sentences that may not resonate with somebody.
Mm-hmm.
You may come back the next day and somebody has been there and put their response to
Mm-hmm.
what you wrote there. And I'm thinking about a project in the future where I actually like highlight that kind of ability of like creating space where people are invited to actually come and do that.
Mm-hmm.
But like when people stand in front of one of these walls, and in the last 10 years, I think it has been used a lot of a backdrop for like artists too, like a heavy graffiti wall or a
Mm-hmm.
wall that's heavily written on, you kind of start to understand it more. Just like you understand music more when
Mm-hmm.
you're kind of inclined to listen to that, and you can see the different conversations of people trying to get above each other to the highest spot of the
Yeah.
wall or have the biggest piece at the wall. There's like a whole set of rules connected to that culture too that some people play to, and some people don't. Yeah.
I'm curious how else you think, because I know you've done some murals locally as well and partnered with some businesses to do art for them. And I'm wondering just like what you think the impact of public art is on a community generally.
Yes, I love that question. And I want to say that I, like, for a long time, refused to put graffiti and art in one bucket.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you're also speaking to is like there is graffiti and then there's muralism,
Mm-hmm.
and both of them are very different. So much at this point that people who do murals have absolutely no connection to graffiti anymore,
Mm-hmm.
and people who do graffiti would never dream of painting a mural.
Mm-hmm.
They're very different aspects, but they do have overlaps.
Yeah.
And so it can bring a community together, as in a mural that is done by a community
Mm-hmm.
for the community. I did a mural for 7 Directions of Service out in Mebane, where we were using the image of a sturgeon, of a prehistoric fish. And the concept of the mural became basically a big river, and then we cut out stencils in the shape of sturgeons. So nobody had to actually have any particular skill for drawing it. We just offered them like stencils, and people made their own stencils
Mm-hmm.
too, but everybody was able to choose their own colors in their own spot in the wall, and they could do more or less with it. But that was something that brought community together. It was
Yeah.
a very simple tool to give people an entrance into this is spray paint. This is how you use it with stenciling, which we haven't really talked about at all. Stenciling is also an important part of this whole culture. The shadow side of this is also gentrification. That
Mm-hmm.
murals are used to gentrify, to raise, the beauty standards of a
Mm-hmm.
building. And when an HOA really, is on fire, then like they want certain murals with certain messages, and they will not allow anything else. So there's also like a sellout part. I think the friction started when walls that had been graffitied for a very long time were suddenly covered in murals.
Oh.
So where there was an erasure, and for a long time, muralists had to be careful and still have to in certain cities. If there is a person who owns the building and they want it changed, totally fair. They don't want to look at that graffiti anymore. But if there is a writer on that wall that doesn't like that, it may very well be that he comes back or she comes back or they come back and will paint over that mural.
Yeah.
And I leave that up, to anybody to say like this is fair or that is not fair. But it is a dynamic where erasure happens through something else. And after whatever 15, 20 years now that we have more and more murals and people want murals, it has become something that is a very powerful tool in community for pushing people out and including people, just like every other art form. And of course, one of my favorite guys connected paint to like a sprinkler.
Oh. Uh-huh.
Yeah, but he connects it. He connects a sprinkler to basically a tank with paint and a generator, and it's these garden sprinklers that go like back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
But he fills them with paint and turns them on, and then he does these giant murals. So they are like he just does wave shapes and things like this. And I will look up the name and send that later to you. But that is like something that is super abstract, super new, and nobody will probably say that's bullshit.
Yeah.
However, to some graffiti sprayers, it may look just like the perfect background to put a writing on.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how I look on it. Of commissions or murals. So it's like, yeah, the style would fit really nicely to that sunset or something like this. And I think it's also room for renewal. There's some very old murals.
Yeah.
Again, very far away from the graffiti culture. I remember like one on Hillsborough Road. I think it's a pet store or something like this. But very intricate animals and nature scenes. It's very faded at this point. Absolutely gorgeous. And then there is experimental stuff that is more activist related. And I think one of the things I made notes of is like, what is beauty in the context of kind of controversial art form?
Yes.
Like writing is, especially in a time when we're experiencing that words that we used to be able to use, we are not allowed to use anymore, to the extent that we very quickly may get in jail for that.
Mm-hmm.
So writing will have to adapt to that. Murals will have to adapt to that. And we enter the time of fairy tales and fables again, where we need to let animal characters speak in riddles in order to express.
Yeah.
And I'm excited for that, to be honest with you. Like I'm excited because there is a long history in my family and in my ancestry of coming up with creative ways of expressing yourself in the face of oppressive systems. And there's a lot of people here that have this experience their entire lives. And so I'm looking forward to seeing these things happening and seeing the resilience of what is important in art. And art always had some people who were looking after it. And the beauty about graffiti is you can't really steal it and bring it anywhere.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw the latest Banksy in London, but it was like a judge was in the stencil. And so it was, I think, at a court building, and it got immediately buffed.
Yes, I saw that.
And then the shadow of it, though, would still look like it. And not 10 days later, somebody recreated that same stencil in a giant version on a beach. And so the ripples of even like, you see a sticker or a scratch in a window or a little tag that sticks out because of the color or because of the swing of the lettering or because you know the name or something like this is where they're like hit by a ripple, and then it may like go from there into other directions. And to go back to your question of community, like there's a lot of artists who are curious about spray paint and want to know more about it. So I also really enjoy just taking people along for the ride and giving them the opportunity to create something together or something for themselves without necessarily teaching them these other 10 rules.
Yes.
But like this is kind of what the paint asks of you. You have to have hands that are a certain size in order to actually spray paint, which is great to keep it out of kids' hands because they literally can't really do anything with it. You have to respect the temperatures at whatever like medium you are painting on. But other than that, learn to paint something without touching it. And that's for a lot of people like a really beautiful experience. I think there should be just a photo series of people doing that for the first time and how they respond to that feeling, because it does vibrate in your hand.
Yeah.
It does feel like it is an extension of your hand too. So there's a lot to it.
I love that. I really resonated with a lot of what you said, and something that you're making me think about with just all of the collaborations you've mentioned is that I didn't get to ask you what brought you to Durham. Like you mentioned some of your work in Mebane, but what brought you to this community specifically?
Yeah, pretty much a leap of faith. I was at the time very committed to a place that closed down suddenly. And so I was outside Chapel Hill, kind of in the sticks, with a 1-year-old and my partner. And I was out of a job suddenly. And so we got an invitation to come to Durham and get a really good deal on a house that we were renting if I was building a garden there. And so, yeah, that's where we moved. And from then on, it was a pretty tumultuous, like 2.5 years. But that's how I got here in the first place. And since I had lived in a triangle before, I wasn't like a complete stranger to Durham, but I had not spent a lot of time here. With that job ending, really felt also called to move to an urban environment again, which was an environment that I grew up in, but had not lived in for the past like 13 years prior to coming here. So I was really excited to come here for a summer or for a season or something like this. And it was supposed to happen like a year later or 2 years later. But it happened then, and Rilke has this poem about widening circles. And whenever I land somewhere, and at this point, I've lived at 3 continents. So whenever I land, I like to land somewhere in the winter when the land is visible, when kind of the curtains have fallen and you see the bare bones of the country and of the land, and start walking. And with a little kid and the dog that we had, that was the most sensible thing to do. I love Durham for its accessibility with public transport, which I know is, in comparison with some places, a joke, and also in comparison with other places that I've lived in, is very, very good. And so, starting in my immediate area that I moved in and building relationships with my neighbors, creating a home for myself and a little child, limited me to a really small radius. And I widened that every week, every month, a little bit more. And I have a really beautiful route now, or larger neighborhood that is maybe 2 or 3 miles in diameter, where I have everything I need, and within that radius, and that feels nice. And I haven't seen a lot of cities where that was really that accessible. I have not really joined any communities deeply, but I have been looking deeper into communities in the last 6 months after significant life changes last year and the year before, and am about to join some circles for the long haul. And that is in part connected to my activism, particularly eco-justice and social justice, and that informs my community very much. I've lived in very white liberal places, which was exhausting in its own way, and I enjoy being in Durham, where I can find places where discourse is sometimes a little more pointed or a little more direct, and that's okay. And I missed that for a long time, living in the South. And now I find these outlets, and I find the outlets for dancing and the outlets for singing, which is like one of the art forms that I've picked up very recently again. And then the places that I paint for, the Pinhook, the Fruit, Club Era, these are all places that are part of collective liberation
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
change and safe places for people. And I'm learning more about the annoying parts of getting into a community, which is like hearing all the drama.
Yeah, yeah.
And I have made a very conscious decision not to get into drama, which I'm very happy that I'm not connected to the drama version of all of this. And also the drama that I'm experiencing recently from a viewer's perspective of the music scene in Durham. I'm like, this is really what I'm not interested in anymore. And that feels good because I used to be young and just like be. God, I can't believe I just said that. I used to be very confrontative and would also stand up for people that I felt like were asking, to be supported, and found more subtle ways to do that. And activism in arts, in my opinion, doesn't have to be pretty, doesn't have to be quiet in a world that is drowning us with noise and stimulation from all angles. It is important that some of us whisper, and it is important that some of us yell it from the mountaintops.
You need every person. And I really liked you mentioning your work of widening your circle, because I think that is also a form of activism. I know that some people are actively seeking community, but are not seeking to speak to their neighbors. And that's not like pointed, but that's like, in my opinion, that's potentially the easiest way to start to build community, right? Just speaking to the people nearby in your immediate vicinity. You don't have to have a whole conversation, but just starting to like get to know the folks around you and the even just your shopkeeper or the people you see on a regular basis, learning their names. For me, that has helped me build community because I'm finding more familiar strangers as I go around Durham. And so when I go to the farmer's market or when I go to, Pinhook or wherever I'm at, I'm like, I don't know that person personally, but I've seen them around. And that makes me feel like I'm in a community, right? And so just some of these small things, like it might not be exactly what you were saying, but for me, it helps me feel like I'm widening my circle because it makes me feel like I'm noticing more. I'm being aware of who's around me. And as I'm seeing these familiar strangers more often, at some point I do just ask for their name. I'm like, hey man, I've seen you 3 times now. What's up? And that actually happened to me this past weekend. I saw someone at a concert on Saturday, and then I was somewhere else on Sunday, and they were like, hey, didn't I see you yesterday? And I was like, yeah, you did. How you doing? We just kept going. And it was in a completely different context, but it was so sweet to just like see and be seen.
And I think that is kind of what in our society at the moment is the level of community that most people have capacity for.
Yeah.
I personally look for something deeper in my community. Not saying that like what we just talked about has not like a certain depth.
Mm-hmm.
And I've ventured more this summer into really also taking my kid out and see who we meet and connect with them. And I also believe that I want even deeper connection and community. Like what you just described made me think of the sentence, you're known. Like when you see somebody and they recognize you, it's the feeling like, oh, I'm known, this person is known. And for people who move around a lot, that happens over and over again when they start settling in. And that's a really beautiful experience. I also live in a neighborhood where not everybody talks to each other, but I have a secret weapon, like a 1.5-year-old.
Oh, yeah.
Just cannot like wave back or start talking. So in this time raising this kid, we were just, walking down the road to the playground, and eventually we would know everybody on either side of the road. It's not the community that would sustain me.
Yes.
At my core. Neither would be the community that I would find in in places for concerts or music. These connections play an integral part for me. I think for myself, when the absence of family, of actually physically family living with me, me like go towards that direction more, like really towards intentional community. And they're very expensive here in Durham. They're very inaccessible to live communally with somebody. But that is kind of one thing that I think is, in terms of community beauty, community collaboration is another ultimate art piece, is how do you patch together a tribe or a community out of people that are not necessarily connected by blood or by heritage or by a shared life experience, but just find themselves living in dirt.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. I think that there are levels to it, just like with friends, and you can group friends within community, but I don't rely on every friend for everything. You know, I have some friends who I'm like, this is my going out friend, and like that's fine. And I know I'm her going out friend, and like, that's okay.
Yes.
But this other friend, like I'm gonna tell her all of my woes and vent and all of that, and I know she can carry that for me.
Yes.
Neighbor, I'm not gonna give her all of that. If I need my mail like grabbed while I'm traveling, like we at least have some relationship where she can get that for me, and I can like do the same for her. And so I think being open to having those different levels of community is something that I've been working on building, and then just also being intentional about. But also trying to be better about getting depth in the relationships that I do want to invest in, because it does take work and it's not always like so easy, you know? I saw someone say community can be inconvenient, you know? You have to forgive people sometimes, like people say the wrong thing sometimes. And as much as I want to like pull the boundaries card that like Instagram might tell you about, like, yes, you should have boundaries, but also just consider your actual interpersonal relationship with this person, I think. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? It's not don't have boundaries, but consider your relationship with this person in the past, you know?
Yeah, I'm like the worst person to ask about this. Like, there is this sentiment right now about self and like looking after yourself before you look after anybody else. I remember hearing that for the first time back in 2010. Somebody telling me, you got to look after yourself before you can look after others. And I was like, what's with that separation, bro? Like, myself is not, it's not an island. Like, myself is connected to others. So taking care of things outside myself is taking care of myself. So I struggle, in that case with like language, and then some people have use words as terms. Like they have a very fixed definition and they're very sure about that that's the only definition or the definition that is clear with the other person. I find myself in a lot of conversations where I'm like, I think you really mean something different than I do when I say that word. Like vulnerability would be one, for example. Like what is vulnerable and what is not vulnerable. And there is a dominant culture right now, which you can find on Instagram, depending on how you identify. There's like your playbook on how to be vulnerable and within that community, and there's like a consensus about it. But I think that the next generation that is growing up right now will whoop our ass for something. I'm not sure for what it is right now, but some of the things that we think are really revolutionary and cool right now will turn out not to be. And I'm not sure really which part of it that is, but I think how we define self and how we are talking about boundaries and like to me it feeds more into like an isolated state of life. And there's a lot of people that disagree on that, but I do believe that at my core that there is something about how we perceive the self that is ego-centered,
Yeah.
more so than actually mycelium-centered.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like when it appears to be isolated, but it is actually connected very deeply. And if all strings of liberation are connected, if that is a truth that will hold up, then ultimately all strings of oppression are connected also.
Yeah.
And we post it online.
Mm-hmm.
And we're like, look, I am connected to collective liberation.
Mm-hmm.
But then we don't show, oh, and I ordered something from Amazon too. So
Yeah.
here is my contribution to collective oppression.
Uh-huh.
And I would hope that more people would actually speak about that. Or they are also connected to collective oppression.
Yeah.
Nobody really wants to talk about this because it's kind of a downer.
It's,
But that's where I get excited.
mm-hmm.
You know, that's where
It's
I like it.
too nuanced of a conversation to have easily.
Uh-huh.
And the internet wants 30-second clips.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't put this in a 30-second
Mm-hmm.
clip because, like you said, it is important to share information on the internet for accessibility. But, like, the iPhone that you're using was made on the backs of, like, children in the Congo, right? To, like, get that. They're mining.
Cobalt, yeah.
The cobalt,
Mm-hmm.
yes, the cobalt that goes in the chip in the phone. The internet is tied to the data centers that are being placed in Black and brown neighborhoods. That's using up the clean water. There's just so many, like you said, so many interconnected things.
Yeah.
It's hard to truly opt out of all of it and say that anything is exclusively good or bad.
Right.
And I'm still really contending with that in my relationship to technology. And, you know, it's an iterative process. And like you said, we'll see in the future, I guess, how the future will judge us. Just how we judge, 10 or 20 years ago.
I mean, we're not very soft on the boomers, which I am
No.
fine with.
They won't be soft
I'm
on us
already
either.
afraid of like what I'm gonna have to listen to. And I'm just very stoked about the activism that I see.
Yes.
Right now too. I'm positively worried for the future at this point, and also come from a line of people who have lived in oppressive systems, and I know there's a lot of people that share that experience, and that resilience and resistance have many beautiful faces and small gestures. I don't want to say that this is not valid.
Yes.
That small gestures are very important for collective liberation, and also as one of my favorite dermite transplants, Adrienne Marie Brown says.
Yes, love her.
Just following their kind of words through the arts and how to show up in times when we're grieving something that is changing so much that we may not recognize it afterwards, and it sparks a lot of fear. But to dare to dream, to dare to really envision and allow ourselves to imagine what if things go right. Just recently with the flotilla, there was one post that Adrienne shared about, let's just imagine that, they arrive and it works out. I think that's a very powerful sentiment that doesn't come naturally to me, but in my work with earth and land, there's a lot of pain there that I'm not sure how many people are really aware of, like how much work is ahead of us and how much is done right now that will cause even more wounds in the landscape.
Yeah, we're in the midst of reimagining a new world, right? Like who should I see talk about this? I'm practicing being better citing my quotes, but
Yeah.
I want to say it was Saidiya Hartman, who is an author, and she says that she just talks about everything has come from someone's imagination, right? And this is in line with what Adrienne Marie Brown says as well. But if these laws, if these buildings, if these streets have all come from someone's imagination, everything can be reimagined. So nothing is fixed. And I think that does give me hope, you
Mm,
know?
yeah.
And so I think this is a really nice place to start to close. Do you have anything that you'd like to share or promote as we end off?
Well, I do want to say thank you to you first of all, and also to a lot of people that probably will never hear that podcast, people that I met along the way. And there's also friends like my friend Mickey or Saleh, my family that have supported me in that latest iteration of my transformation, becoming a single parent, daring to go out and make more art, and yeah, supporting my healing along the way. And there's a lot of people that I could name now, but also in Durham, I think a shout out to the places that give refuge to the people of the night, to the creatures that come out when, it's dark and it's time to have some tough conversations over some drinks in bars, by a park, a concert, people who just meet each other, look each other in the eye at a protest and have meaningful conversations. A shout out to all of them. And I think the Sumut Flotilla is one thing I am very glad that it is happening. Yeah, and finally, free Palestine, free Sudan, free Congo,
Yes.
and these oppressions. We can just keep fighting. And I'm somebody who, tends to be pretty forward and direct, and I appreciate everybody who's not, because that is the vibe right now, and it is important to feed into a softer revolution. And also a shout out to everybody who is like, I just can't with softness right now, and some things need to change drastically. And so shout out to everybody who cares about raising life, yeah, about keeping the world beautiful and making it more accessible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for listening for today's challenge. I'm going to lean on the quote by Gloria Steinem: dreaming is a form of planning. So I challenge you to do some dreaming and then think about those dreams and what they inspire you to plan to do. So have a great rest of your day.